Ever wake up, try to get your kid to school, and find three bulldozers blocking your driveway like some kind of construction disaster? Oh, and then some woman with sunglasses so huge they could double as parachutes starts yelling about HOA-approved landscaping violations while you're holding a crying toddler. Yeah, that was my Tuesday. But here's the kicker. I'm the one running the construction authority that sent those bulldozers in the first place. And I'm not a fan of being blocked on my own property. It all started at exactly 7:46 a.m., a time I'll never forget, not because anything special happened, but because I glanced at the clock while spreading peanut butter on toast with one hand, my toddler on my hip, and a sock hanging from my mouth. We were running behind. Like usual, my daughter had decided pants were a social construct, and I wasn't in the mood to argue with a 3-year-old philosopher. I finally managed to get her dressed, grabbed her backpack, and opened the garage to, what the hell, 3 massive yellow bulldozers, each parked like a herd of drunken elephants, completely blocked my circular driveway. And they weren't just parked carelessly. No, they were perfectly positioned to trap my car like some construction-themed hostage situation. There was caution tape, cones, and even a guy eating a bagel while leaning on a shovel, acting like he was on break at a sandbox. For a moment, I thought I'd missed some kind of citywide evacuation order, or maybe aliens had landed and needed to repave the planet. And then she showed up. Karen, of course, in all her middle-aged, overly tanned, clipboard-holding glory. Her sunglasses covered half her face and probably had their own ecosystem. She was wearing a neon orange HOA vest, looking like she was directing traffic at the gates of suburban hell. And she was armed with a smug smile that made me want to commit at least 3 minor offenses. Mr. Al-Karim, she said, mispronouncing my name like it was some power move. You've been sent 3 notices. We are now starting phase 2 of the neighborhood beautification plan. Your non-compliant front yard features must be removed. I blinked. Features? She nodded, tapping her clipboard like she was delivering a death sentence. The stone fountain. It's not HOA approved. It doesn't fit with the community aesthetic. My daughter started crying. She couldn't stand loud noises or strangers, and now both had arrived with bulldozers. I tried to calm her down, bouncing a little while shooting Karen a death stare. So your solution was to block my driveway with city-owned construction equipment? Karen sniffed. They're here for the work. It's not my fault your design choices don't align with our vision. Vision. I repeated, laughing a little. What is this, a cult? She didn't respond. She turned on her perfectly manicured heel and waved at the workers like she was directing a Broadway show. One of the guys gave me a guilty shrug, but kept cranking up his machine. My daughter screamed louder. I stood there, boiling with anger, feeling my ears burn. I couldn't even leave my own house. Not because of any emergency or safety issue, but because Karen and her little HOA clique decided my fountain didn't fit their cookie-cutter vision of the neighborhood. This wasn't the first time. It all started small. A passive-aggressive note about my mailbox being slightly off-center. A warning about the patterns on my mosaic tiles being too much. Then, a notice saying my front door's arch wasn't up to code. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was just some over-the-top HOA nonsense. But then the fines started rolling in. $50 here, $75 there. When I asked for details, they told me the aesthetic guidelines had been updated recently and were available for review at an HOA meeting I wasn't invited to. Still, I tried to be reasonable. I reached out to the board. I showed them my permits, documents, even historical references for the architectural style of my house. They ignored me. Karen barely hid her disgust when I spoke. Once, she muttered something about how my house looked like a foreign embassy and told me to leave before I said something that would get me arrested. But this was something else. She didn't just have an issue with my fountain. She went out of her way to hijack public equipment. Illegally, I might add, to make a point. A bulldozer-sized point. And she timed it perfectly. During school rush hour. Maximum disruption. Maximum embarrassment. I had to carry my toddler down the street, dodging construction debris and the curious looks of neighbors peering through their blinds. One woman even filmed me on her phone. I walked past a couple of Karens in matching velour tracksuits, arms crossed, shooting me judgmental glares like they were auditioning for the HOA version of The Godfather. No one offered to help. No one asked if I needed a ride. I flagged down a friend who lived 6 blocks away and begged them for a lift to my daughter's daycare. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with notifications, a reminder from the HOA about upcoming community meetings, an automatic fine for obstruction during scheduled landscaping, and an email from Karen titled, "Community Harmony Requires Sacrifice." I wanted to shout. Instead, I clenched my jaw, dropped my daughter off, and drove straight to the office. Most people don't know what I do. They think I'm just another guy with a nice house and an imported car. But I'm more than just a civil engineer. I'm the director of operations for the County Construction Authority. Every work order involving city-owned heavy machinery, it all goes through my department. Every rental, every project, every contractor approval. So, when I pulled up the request log for the bulldozers and saw that someone had used a clearly forged permit to redirect them to a residential neighborhood for a community-approved excavation, my jaw tightened. The signature? Unreadable. The contractor? One-eyed and flagged for past violations. The work order? Altered. Karen hadn't just taken a risk. She'd crossed the line into felony territory. And the best part? She had no clue. I sat back, staring at the screen, the pieces clicking together. This wasn't about a fountain. It never was. This was about power, about reshaping the neighborhood into a bland, perfect vision, even if it meant getting rid of anything that stood out. And me? I was the first flaw in her beige little empire. My phone buzzed again. A message from the contractor. Work stopped due to a complaint. The HOA president wants to talk to someone in charge. I smirked. Karen was about to learn that the guy she tried to bulldoze had the power to bulldoze right back. But not with machinery. With paperwork. With the law. With precision. And no, I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to bury her plan so deep in red tape, she'd need an excavation permit just to get air. But just as I was about to start drafting the first formal complaint, an email popped up from the county legal office. The subject line read, "Urgent. Allegation of misconduct involving Director Alkarim. See attached." Karen had filed a complaint against me. She was making her move first. Again. And now, it wasn't just about a driveway or a fountain. Now it was war. It's funny how fast a petty argument over a fountain turns into a bureaucratic chess game when someone like Karen decides to up the ante. I hadn't even finished my coffee when the county legal office sent me an official-looking document packed with red flags like a broken carnival ride. According to her complaint, I had used insider. Karen used her knowledge and city resources to target a volunteer HOA president during a simple neighborhood beautification project. That was exactly how it was described. She made it sound like she was some kind of peacekeeper, as if she were an ambassador for the UN, instead of just a petty tyrant with a personal vendetta against colored tiles and unconventional archways. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, equally entertained and irritated. The nerve was astounding. She had turned the city's bureaucracy against someone who helped manage it. I had to admit, her boldness was impressive, even if her approach was as subtle as a jackhammer in a library. But what she didn't get, and could never get, was that she was in my territory now. While she may have known how to run an HOA meeting and shame neighbors over their recycling bins, I knew how to bring down entire projects with one line of legal jargon. She had started this war. Now, it was time to lay the foundation for a complete takedown. First, I needed to clear my name before the county office took her little fantasy seriously. I gathered every relevant document, timestamps, work orders, equipment logs, and internal memos. Those 3 bulldozers on my property, they were assigned to a sewer maintenance project in a different zip code. I highlighted the forged permit that rerouted them to my address and traced it back to a private contractor named Hector Ruiz. Hector and I had a history. He was the kind of guy who cut corners with a grin. 2 years ago, I had flagged him for submitting fake insurance certificates. The guy was a walking disaster. A quick phone call confirmed what I suspected. Karen had approached him to do a volunteer community cleanup, claiming that the HOA had some kind of secret deal with the city. She even provided a document that looked almost identical to one of our official permits, except it had 2 typos in the header and was signed by someone named Derek H. Collins, a made-up supervisor who didn't and never had existed. Ruiz, being Ruiz, didn't care. He took cash, avoided questions, and showed up with his crew and borrowed equipment. Equipment that was now burning through thousands of unapproved operational hours. I added that to the file. Then I started building my case. You see, when someone misuses city equipment, it's not just about the immediate impact or disruption. It becomes a liability issue. If anyone had gotten hurt during the HOA's unauthorized digging, the city would have been on the hook. That alone was enough to spark a formal investigation. Investigations, especially when they involve public resources and private interference, had a way of uncovering all kinds of shady secrets. But I wasn't planning on stopping there. Karen had already made a fool of me in front of my neighbors. She'd blocked me from taking my daughter to daycare. She'd spun up some wild story to try to tarnish my reputation at work. This wasn't just about settling the score. This was about making a statement. She wanted a beautification project? I'd show her a full-blown legal excavation, one that uncovered every shady deal she and her HOA board had been running for the last year. The next step was to quietly send a city inspector for an unannounced audit of the HOA's ongoing construction. That meant every nail, every bucket of paint, every invoice would need to be accounted for. Karen's little empire was built on cutting corners and shady deals with questionable contractors. An official audit would be like shining a spotlight on a dirty little secret. While that was happening, I filed a formal stop work order for the entire neighborhood. No permits, no progress. Everything came to a halt. The bulldozers? Recalled. The project? Dead in the water. By noon, my phone was buzzing nonstop. First, it was the contractor freaking out because his access badge had been shut off and a city investigator had shown up asking about the forged paperwork. Then was my neighbor Mark, the guy who always wore golf polos, even though he never played golf. He wanted to know why landscaping improvements were suddenly on pause. I told him to ask the HOA. Let them explain it. But the real kicker came around 3 p.m. when Karen herself called my office. She had the nerve to demand an explanation, all fake sweetness layered with passive-aggressive anger. I let her rant for a minute before I spoke. Karen, I said, keeping it casual, you filed a formal complaint against a government official with false information. You redirected city property to private land with a fake permit. You hired an unlicensed contractor to do unauthorized work on homes that didn't approve it. And now you're upset because your operation got shut down? That's bold. I'll give you that. There was a long silence. Then she scoffed. This is political. You're retaliating. I have every right to improve our community. You have the right to follow the law, I said, which you didn't. She started to say something, but I ended the call. There was nothing more to say over the phone. The next day, the neighborhood was alive with chatter. People were starting to ask questions. Why were city investigators snapping pictures of the HOA signs? Why did the landscaper's truck get towed? Why was all scheduled work suddenly halted? Karen tried to manage the situation. She sent out an urgent email claiming there had been a minor bureaucratic issue due to an overreaction by a city official. It was almost funny watching her try to spin it, as if I had just had a rough day and decided to ruin her project out of spite. But the truth was, the wheels had already been set in motion, and I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. It turned out that Karen's authoritarian approach hadn't won her many friends on the board. I got an anonymous tip from one of the HOA treasurers, a guy named Rick who had been on the board for years. He sent me copies of internal emails, meeting minutes, and even screenshots of group chats where Karen casually suggested finding residents to boost the beautification funds. In one, she outright said, the Alcareems don't know how to blend in. Maybe they'll get the message if the fines stack up high enough. That hit me hard, not because I was shocked, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected from the beginning. This wasn't about landscaping or property values. It was about power, about conformity, about pushing out anyone who didn't fit Karen's idea of suburban purity. And now, I had it all documented. I sent a summary to the city attorney's office. Not as a formal complaint just yet, but as a heads up, a notice that this was starting to smell. They took it seriously. And just like that, the county launched a secondary investigation into the HOA's finances. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just up against me. She was up against audits, legal teams, and an ever-growing stack of evidence. But even as everything around her began to collapse, she didn't back down. That's the thing about people like Karen. They never think they're wrong. The day of the community meeting felt like a cross between a poorly planned town hall and a middle school play written by someone who hated logic. Folding chairs were set up in neat rows at the local community center, with a plastic table at the front covered by a faded HOA banner that might have looked professional if it weren't stained with a suspicious coffee spill. The room was filled with a low hum of confusion, gossip, and the nervous rustling of printed emails. Karen had set the scene like she was about to give a TED Talk on the dangers of cultural fountains and unconventional mailboxes. I showed up early, not because I was excited, but because I wanted a front row seat to the disaster. Karen, of course, was already there, surrounded by her inner circle. They were dressed in matching teal cardigans and self-satisfied grins. They looked more like they were prepping for a bake sale than orchestrating a neighborhood inquisition. Karen gave me a thin, tight-lipped smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The whole petty drama spoke for itself. The notice for this hearing was almost laughable. A public vote to decide whether I had, in Karen's words, created a hostile environment for volunteers and misused city resources to disrupt planned HOA improvements. Her wording was careful, just vague enough to avoid any direct legal accusations, yet specific enough to paint me as some kind of bureaucratic villain. It might have been impressive if it weren't so transparently desperate. By the time the room was packed, there wasn't even space to stand. The word had spread about the cease and desist, the construction halt, and the city investigation. People were confused, some frustrated, and a lot just curious. Most had no clue about the full story. They'd only caught fragments, bulldozers, fines, permits, and now they were here to watch the spectacle unfold. Karen stood up, cleared her throat with theatrical flair, and launched into her opening speech as if she was running for office, though no one had asked her to. She went on about community values, neighborhood pride, and how tough it was to volunteer her time only to face hostility and roadblocks. She tossed around terms like integrity and stewardship, like she was narrating her own personal documentary. The performance was nearly flawless until she began twisting the facts. According to her, the bulldozers had been arranged through the proper channels, and the confusion was just a clerical error, likely a mix-up between departments. She painted herself as a victim of bureaucracy and overreach. She never mentioned the forged documents, the shady contractor, or the completely fabricated work order, just a well-intentioned public servant trying to improve the neighborhood. Then, she invited the board to make statements. Two of them read short blurbs, obviously written by Karen herself, filled with vague compliments and concerns about rising tensions. But when she opened the floor for resident comments, everything shifted. The first to speak was Mark, Mr. Golf Polo. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Look, I don't know all the details, but I do know Omar's always been respectful. He helped my wife carry groceries when her foot was in a cast. And I've never seen anything wrong with his fountain. It's actually kind of nice," he added. Karen's smile twitched. Then Lisa, who lived 3 doors down from me, stood up. "I thought we had voted against the landscaping changes last year. Why is this still going on?" Someone from the back spoke up. "Wasn't that construction crew not even licensed?" Karen tried to regain control. She tapped the microphone, gripping it tightly, like she was on the verge of losing it. "Let's stay on topic, please. This is about Mr. Alkarim's behavior." I stood up. The room went quiet. I didn't bring any papers. I didn't need to. Everything was already burned into my memory. I kept my tone steady but firm. "I'm not here to defend my actions," I said, "because I haven't done anything wrong. What I have done is respond to an illegal use of city property, carried out with a forged permit, executed by an unlicensed contractor, and planned by someone who not only overstepped their authority, but tried to bury me under a pile of fake accusations to cover it up." A murmur spread through the room. Karen's face went tight, like a clenched bag. I went on. "The bulldozers blocking my driveway? They were supposed to be 3 miles away, working on a bus or main repair. That project got delayed because someone lied to the city and redirected them. The equipment was used without permission, meaning your tax dollars were spent on what amounts to a personal project by this HOA. Karen tried to cut me off, but I raised my hand. I'm still speaking. You had your turn. She sank back, fuming. I've submitted a full report to the city, with timestamps, emails, and signed statements. And I've included internal messages from the HOA board. Yes, I have those too, where Karen called certain residents non-conforming eyesores and suggested raising fines to push them out. Now, the whispers turned into loud voices. People started talking to each other, leaning in, eyes darting to Karen, whose jaw was clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might break. A man spoke up. Did she really say that? I nodded. It's in writing. Screenshots don't lie. Karen shot up suddenly, knocking over her water bottle. This is a smear campaign. You're twisting everything. No, I said calmly. This is about accountability. You try to shame me for the way my house looks, for the culture it represents. You try to turn the neighborhood against me with petty fines and anonymous complaints. But I'm not going anywhere. And I'm certainly not going to sit back while you misuse public property to bulldoze what you don't understand. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Rick, the board treasurer who'd sent me the screenshots, slowly stood up. I motioned to suspend Karen from the board while we investigated. Karen spun around, her face full of shock. Rick, I've seen the emails too, he said matter-of-factly. Another board member nodded. Seconded. It felt like someone had just flipped a switch on her authority. Karen scanned the room, eyes frantic, hoping someone would stand up for her. But all she got were turned heads and crossed arms. The same people who used to eagerly follow her every command were now quietly pulling back. I took a step back, letting the situation settle in. The motion passed. Karen was immediately removed from her position. But that wasn't the end of it. Far from it. The very next morning, I got a call from the city attorney's office. The investigation into the HOA's finances had uncovered some questionable transactions, payments to contractors under fake names, strange cash withdrawals, unrecorded consulting fees. And guess whose signature was on most of the paperwork? Karen's. And now, it wasn't just about losing her clipboard or her little domain of matching mailboxes. Now there were lawyers involved. And Karen? She was about to find out what real consequences looked like. Karen's downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, quiet, and deeply humiliating, like wallpaper peeling at the edges after years of hidden water damage. One day, she was the queen of the cul-de-sac, barking orders and threatening fines for things like where people placed their flower pots. The next, she was a disgraced former president of a suburban dictatorship, walking past neighbors who wouldn't even look her in the eye, pretending not to hear the gossip trailing behind her down the sidewalk. And trust me, there was gossip. The city's investigation into the HOA's finances pulled on a thread Karen thought no one would ever dare touch. Unfortunately for her, that thread led to an entire drawer full of forged invoices, fake consulting fees, and payments made to companies that didn't even exist. One of the landscaping firms she'd hired for a $7,200 project was actually registered under her nephew's name, a guy who lived 3 states away and had never lifted a shovel in his life. She treated the HOA like her own personal ATM, and now the receipts were piling up faster than she could come up with a cover story. What began as a small act of revenge on my part grew into something much larger. The county stepped in and took over the investigation. A third-party auditor was assigned to examine every HOA transaction from the past 3 years. The residents were shocked. Some were furious. A few felt embarrassed when they realized they had approved projects they didn't fully understand because Karen claimed they were for the good of the community. She had cloaked herself in the rhetoric of progress and unity while quietly draining the budget for her own personal desires. Yet, even then, she tried to cling to some sense of control. She sent emails claiming she was the victim of political targeting, insisting it was all a misunderstanding and that her removal was temporary. She even tried to attend one of the emergency HOA meetings, but 2 officers from the city attorney's office showed up and politely escorted her out. That night, her porch light stayed off for the first time in years. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood began to change in ways Karen never would have permitted. People started talking to each other more. Not in the fake, forced way Karen had encouraged, smiling long enough to deliver a warning, but real conversations. One neighbor Gloria, a retired architect, volunteered to help update the community design standards. Another neighbor formed a committee focused on cultural inclusion and preservation, ensuring no one would face fines for having a front yard that looked too different. I was asked to join the newly structured HOA board. At first, I turned it down. I'd had enough suburban drama to last a lifetime. But after some reflection, and after several neighbors came to me for help understanding the bylaws, I agreed. Not because I wanted power, but because I had learned the hard way what happens when people like Karen aren't held accountable. Someone had to make sure this never happened again. Our first new board meeting was held in the same community center where Karen's rule had ended, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Gone were the power plays and veiled threats. People brought coffee, shared ideas, and actually listened. There was laughter, real laughter. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we weren't just neighbors living next door to each other. We were part of something better. As for Karen, her house was sold quietly. No open house. No cheerful flyers and mailboxes. Just a discreet listing buried on a local realtor's website with no interior photos. Word spread that she was moving to a low-maintenance condo out of state, probably somewhere she couldn't stir up as much trouble. On the morning she moved out, I stood at the end of my driveway, sipping coffee, watching the movers load her last boxes. She didn't look at me. She kept her head down, her oversized sunglasses still in place, and climbed into her car without saying a word. I didn't wave. I didn't gloat. I just nodded once to myself and went back inside. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't one final petty moment I indulged in. A few days after she left, I hosted a community event in my front yard. It was a multicultural potluck, something I'd always wanted to do, but never dared under Karen's reign with her clipboard of doom. We had tables filled with homemade food, samosas, empanadas, pierogies, jerk chicken, baklava, everything. People brought dishes from their cultures, and we ate under strings of lights, sharing stories about our families, our traditions, and yes, even our experiences with the HOA. My fountain was lit up that night, sparkling in the dusk, as music from a small speaker played traditional oud melodies mixed with jazz. Kids ran around barefoot. Someone's dog swiped half a kebab, and not a single person complained. One older neighbor came up to me, misty-eyed, and told me my home reminded her of her childhood in Granada. She thanked me for keeping it the way it was. That meant more than I could ever express. Later that week, I received a letter from the county council. They had reviewed the situation and, recognizing the HOA's failure to uphold inclusive standards, approved a proposal to rename our street. Effective immediately, our road, once known simply as Cypress Bend Lane, was now officially Mosaic Lane, a tribute to the diverse cultures, styles, and voices that made our neighborhood what it was. A small gesture, but a meaningful one. I framed the notice and hung it in my office. The irony still made me smile. Karen had tried to erase difference, to smooth over anything that didn't fit her beige-washed ideal of perfection. But in doing so, she unintentionally brought the whole neighborhood together, just not in the way she had intended. Her bulldozing tactics, her fake permits, her campaign for conformity, every bit of it backfired spectacularly. And I didn't have to raise my voice. I didn't have to play dirty. I let her dig her own hole, and I handed the county the shovel. In the end, all it took was patience, paperwork, and a little bit of poetic justice. Funny thing about bulldozers, they can flatten anything in their way, but they can also build roads. Sometimes, all you need to do is move the one blocking your driveway, and maybe lay out a welcome mat that says, "Come as you are," right where Karen once planned to plant shrub.